Lucas was an avid adventurer who lived to explore the unknown. One day, while wandering through a flea market in a small seaside town, an old map caught his eye. It was lying on a dusty counter among other useless things, but something about it seemed unusual to him. The map was covered in a network of small cracks, as if it had been folded and unfolded over centuries. It showed mountains, forests, and a small valley surrounded by symbols that Lucas could not immediately decipher. In the center of the map was a name: City of Eternal Shadow. "Interesting," he muttered, picking up the map. The seller, an older man with a keen gaze, chuckled. "Think you'll find something?" "Maybe," Lucas replied. "Do you know anything about this place?" The shopkeeper just shook his head. "Nobody knows. Legend has it that this city disappeared from all records long ago. No one has ever returned from there." These words only fueled Lucas's interest. He bought the map, feeling that a door to something incredible was opening before him. A few days later, he was already on his way. The mountainous area indicated on the map was far from all modern routes, and the closer he got, the more abandoned and wild the area became. When he reached the entrance to the dense forest surrounding the place marked as the City of Eternal Shadow, the air became oppressive. The silence was so deep that any rustle underfoot seemed like a loud echo. At sunset, Lucas came to the edge of the forest, and a valley opened up before him. In its center was a city, shrouded in a light fog. The buildings looked old and slanted, but their outlines somehow retained strength and grandeur, as if they were watching him. "I found it," Lucas whispered, as he descended into the valley, unaware that the city had been waiting for its new guest for a long time. As Lucas entered the city, he was overcome with a strange mixture of excitement and unease. The dusty streets were strewn with trash, the remnants of a once vibrant life. Chairs lay in the middle of the sidewalks, doors to houses were ajar, and here and there were overturned carts. It was as if the inhabitants had left the place in a hurry, leaving their business unfinished. He peered into the first building, which looked like a tavern. Inside, dust covered everything: the wooden tables, the mugs left on the counter. Cards and dice were strewn on the floor, as if they had been thrown in the middle of a game. But there was something else in the air, oppressive and heavy, as if the city itself were a living being. The streets were completely silent, broken only by the echo of his own footsteps. Lucas felt his every step echoing in the walls of the buildings, as if the city was listening. The further he went, the stronger the feeling became that he was not alone. Several times he turned around, thinking he had seen movement out of the corner of his eye, but he saw no one. Towards evening, when the fog began to thicken, Lucas decided to stop in one of the surviving huts. As he unrolled his sleeping bag, he smelled a strange smell, a mixture of dampness and mustiness, and suddenly heard a sound. It was a quiet, muffled whisper coming from the street. He carefully peered out the window. Someone was standing in the foggy street. A figure in a long cloak stared motionless in the direction of his house. "Who is it?" he called out. But there was no answer. The next morning, the figure had disappeared, but the streets now seemed less empty. Lucas began to notice people flickering somewhere in the distance. Some were looking out of windows, others were simply standing in the shadows. They did not come closer, but they always watched him. Every day there were more of them. Now, when he passed houses, he saw faces peering out from cracks in the walls or gaps in the doors. Their eyes were dull, full of heavy emptiness, but they watched his every move. The city no longer seemed abandoned. It seemed as if it was awakening, and with it, its inhabitants. Lucas no longer knew how much time had passed since he entered the city. The days merged into a gray haze, and the sun no longer showed itself due to the thick fog that enveloped the streets. Every time he tried to find an exit, he found himself on the same street, or at the same house where he had been before. The city seemed to be playing with him, not letting him leave. The inhabitants, who at first simply watched him from afar, now began to approach. One night, he was awakened by a light knock on the window. Looking in, he saw a pale face pressed tightly against the glass. The face was silent, the eyes empty, but it disappeared as soon as he came closer. The next day, wandering the streets, he felt someone following him. Turning his head, he saw a group of people, dark and short, men and women, all standing in silence, looking straight at him. Now I could see them. It was professors, mean people. "What do you want?" Lukas shouted, his voice echoing through the streets. But no one answered. They started to approach, and he ran. But the shadows moved faster, blocking his path. His feet sank into the fog, which became thick as water. It was as if the city itself was sucking him in. As he fell to his knees, the air around him became thick, filled with echoing voices. They were not words but whispers that made his head spin. At the last moment, before he lost consciousness, he heard, "You are part of us now." Lukas opened his eyes. He was standing on the street, but something was wrong. His body seemed alien, his movements slow, as if in a viscous dream. He looked at his hands. They were pale, almost transparent, like those he had seen before. The shadows disappeared from the streets, and now the city looked empty again. Light footsteps broke the silence. A new figure appeared in the distance, at the entrance to the city. A traveler with a backpack on his back, walking towards the central square, holding a map in his hands. Lukas understood the truth. He was part of this city now. He, like the others, was doomed to wait for the next guest, to watch him from the shadows until he too became one.